am very excited tonight because for this episode of Interior Integration for Catholics, episode 119, I have a dear colleague, a dear friend of mine, Dr. Peter Martin. Dr. Peter Martin is a clinical psychologist in Lincoln, Nebraska. And interesting fun fact, he and I did our level 1 IFS training together, and it was a blast to be able to do that. Actually, I felt a great degree of comfort because I was actually going with my dear friend, Dr. Peter Martin. We were going to go together. And that way, if it was too woo-woo or if it was too crazy or whatever, I would have somebody to bounce those ideas off of. And so it's great fun now, so many years later, to have Dr. Peter Martin with us in this episode where we're discussing narcissism. So Dr. Peter, I just want to wish you the warmest welcome. Super excited to have you with us tonight.
Hey, it's great to be with you again, Peter. I'm glad you brought that up with level 1 because it was definitely a comfort having you with just kind of exploring a whole new model and getting into the depths. So yeah, it's great to see what's happened since that time. Good to be with you.
Well, so what the plan is tonight is for Dr. Peter Martin and I to just have a conversation about narcissism, to discuss the last episode, the one that was just released. That's episode 118, where we're talking about the best of psychological and human formation resources, looking at narcissism from the single kind of unified personality model, primarily a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic model. We'll talk about that. And then we really want to open this up to whatever questions you have and whatever concerns, that you've had in your own life about this, things that you're willing to share with us as we record this podcast. So we are recording this live on August 7th, and this episode is going to be released on Monday, August 21st. So I'm just really curious, Peter, when you hear the word narcissism, what comes up for you? Like what springs up for you inside when you hear that word?
So for me, like the image that actually comes to mind is Narcissus, the guy that kind of looked at himself in the pool and fell in love. And that became kind of the general approach that he used to, relating to other people and so forth. So that is actually the first image that comes to mind. Also, it brings to mind some of my experiences. Unfortunately, I don't say this with all sports and athletics, but that is the experience I had as I was working through my career in sports, through grade school and high school and beyond. So those are the first things that come to mind, but not positive sentiments. It wasn't something that, that I'd like to share necessarily with my kids and have them experience the same thing I did. But it is something that it does stick with you. Like when you encounter someone that has those kind of features, they kind of stick with you a bit, and you remember them.
Mm-hmm. Often folks do not recognize when they are connecting with somebody, relating with somebody that has strong narcissistic features or has what might be called the narcissistic personality style or even a narcissistic personality disorder. And one of the things that I had been thinking about as I thought about what did not go into episode 118 is this question of, can narcissistic personality styles, are they amenable to treatment? Are they treatable? That's a huge question. And so I'm curious about kind of what your take is on that. I think I may know, but I may be able to guess, but I'm really curious about what you would say about that, because that's a question that comes up a lot.
Yeah, and I think we probably would agree with this. I think both of us would say that there is potential for change. And when I think of change, I think of frequency, intensity, and duration. So how often does that narcissistic part or entitled part show up? We're hoping that it'll decrease in intensity, frequency, and duration, and maybe even change even further than that to more humble. To answer that question, though, I think it is important to know that all of us at some level, at some time of the day, or maybe once a week or something like that, have kind of some narcissistic tendencies. And the reason I bring that up is because the individuals that struggle with this kind of more severe forms of narcissistic PD. They're more kind of extreme levels of what some of us struggle with to some extent. So you'll see this in the spiritual tradition, the Catholic moral and spiritual tradition. You see Pope John Paul II, for instance, saying, if you're not loving someone, you're using them. And that's kind of what narcissistic PDs, individuals that struggle with that profile, let's say, or those kind of extreme parts, they have this tendency to use others more as a narcissistic extension and for their self-esteem issues. I recall a person who I spoke with that said she thought this other individual was narcissistic. And I said, why? And she said, because he told her one time, if you can't trust another person, then you can use him, right? So the idea is that there's a lack of trust, there's a self-esteem issue. And so if you can't have connection and trust with another person, then just use them for personal gain at some level. But yes, I do think that narcissism is a type of functioning that can change over time.
Mm-hmm. That's been my experience. Sometimes, I've seen mental health professionals make the claim that narcissists are beyond help. That persons with narcissistic personality disorder simply can't be treated, and that saddens me, and also for some of my parts gets me angry, because parts will say, just maybe you haven't had luck treating folks with narcissistic styles, but that doesn't mean they're not treatable. Yeah, but you have to go about it in a way that understands the underlying issues, because they are not what they seem like on the surface. And I think we've come a long way in the last 100 years, since this has started to be really studied as a clinical phenomenon. And especially in the last 20 years, with an appreciation of those underlying dynamics of shame and the fear of being humiliated. So.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think, Peter, I do agree that things can change for the better for these individuals. And even within the church's history, for instance, I'm thinking most people probably are familiar with Saint Ignatius of Loyola. I was on retreat at one point, and I picked up a book by Father William Meissner. For those who are wondering who that is, he's a Jesuit priest that is a psychoanalyst. And he wrote a biography of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And if I were to ask you, Peter, how do you think he diagnosed St. Ignatius before the conversion experience? What would be your guess?
I would imagine if he was going to diagnose St. Ignatius from afar, he would have diagnosed him as a narcissist.
You got it. Yep. Yeah. And as a psychoanalyst, is in particular a phallic narcissist.
A phallic narcissist, yeah, which would be the grandiose or overt narcissist, right?
Exactly.
And that makes sense too, given some of his history, his desire for fame and glory, in the military career and so forth. But I've also heard, I can't remember where I read this, but that people at the beginning of St. Ignatius' life would have no doubt that his temperament was choleric. But at the end of his life, people assumed that he was phlegmatic. So it's really interesting to sort of see the change there.
Yeah, and it wasn't without a significant few events in his life to bring about the change. It took God's grace and a cannonball.
And
right?
Cannonball, yep. Sometimes the interventions that God chooses to use, what he allows in his passive will to happen, can be pretty severe.
Yes, and it was for him. Yeah, he had to re-break his leg after they had put it in a cast. I mean, this poor guy. So it took a lot for him to change. But yeah, so there are examples of people that have changed, but more recently, like you're saying, we're noting that this is becoming more and more of an opinion that you'll see in psychology, that there is potential for this kind of growth.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because one thing I didn't talk a lot about in the last episode was kind of the two main ways of treating someone with strong narcissistic dynamics. And this was from my psychoanalyst supervisor when I really started in clinical practice. And he said there's basically two ways you can do this. One is a very gentle way of really trying to help the person with the narcissistic dynamics feel safe, feel heard, really through the relationship with that person, help to just try to help him unfold, and kind of grow. That's the first way. And the second way is to depth charge the narcissistic defenses, is to kind of blow up those narcissistic defenses. But that's really, really risky, because the idea is that, the phoenix will rise from the ashes, but the phoenix doesn't always rise from the ashes. You can see sometimes the narcissistic dynamics very much harden. And I think that's what you're seeing when our Lord goes right at the narcissistic defenses of the Pharisees. You can see that some of those Pharisees actually converted, the majority hardened. And so when I think about that, when I think about biblical characters that have narcissistic traits, not only Absalom, which I mentioned in the last podcast episode, but also the Pharisees.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting take on that. Yeah, I definitely can see those kind of features. And you'll see that with some narcissistic profiles, is that perfectionistic kind of thing, right? This chronic criticism of self or others, but usually it's manifested as of others kind of thing. I think sometimes too, Peter, about the parable of the prodigal son, in terms of one that kind of has certain narcissistic features, is the older brother. Because the older brother had a lot of perfectionism. His younger brother didn't quite fit the bill. And even though the father was very warm and receptive to his return, the older brother was critical not just of the younger brother, the prodigal himself, but of the father for taking him back. And
Right.
so you see that kind of as an extension of what happened with Jesus and the Pharisees in that particular passage.
Right. And so there you see the modeling of the gentleness of the father with the older son. You see that modeling of the warmth and the explanation and the affirmation. All I have is yours. He tells the older son. And sometimes you don't have the luxury of a lot of time. So I don't want anybody to take me as sort of like being critical of our Lord for trying to depth charge the Pharisees' defenses. He knew what he was doing. But again, free will is still operative, even with these dynamics. So
yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah, and so maybe with the Lord, he's really interested in making a point here, not just for what's going on in that particular scenario, but also for other generations to see how he is very different than that narcissistic approach they take. He's very humble in his approach.
that's right. Yeah. Well, he says, "Learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart."
Yeah.
And there's a difference between being narcissistic and being bold. Saint Teresa of Avila, for example, is one of the saints that I admire for her boldness, but that boldness connected to humility and paired up with humility. So,
yeah, I like that too. It reminds me of some of the literature I've seen on kind of servant leadership. We'll talk about humility plus the great souled, or the magnanimity. So if you have the complementary kind of profile of magnanimity plus humility, there is this boldness that goes with it. So you don't have to be this kind of self-denigrating, kind of false humility type of person, but you can have both that great souledness plus humility at the same time.
Exactly. Well, I want to turn to a question that was given to us, that was emailed to us earlier today. And with this, we'll open up the Q&A aspect of our time together. This is a little long, but I think it's worth reading in its entirety because it brings up so many dynamics that we've been talking about. So this listener says, "For years, I have covertly tried to read about narcissism, looking for some explanation of or help with relational dynamics with my husband. I have a distinct memory of my husband talking to my dad over dinner one night, and the entire conversation, a long one, was a monologue about how great he was, with my dad agreeing. We once went to a funeral for the wife of an old friend who is a poor soul, and afterward, the drive home was listening to him and his brother talk about how honored that poor family was to have had them present, and how good it was of them to have taken time from their schedule to show up. It was nauseating. These instances reflect the attitude typical of his family. There's also a strong culture of lying in that family, which they call, quote, stretching, end quote. Things have been improving lately, and so I've forgotten some intense things, but listening to your podcast brings it all back. It makes me feel crazy because suddenly I'm not sure if he is the narcissist or if it's me. During these really crazy days, I spend time trying to verify objectively that what I seem to observe was true. For instance, one of my kids might make a comment, and I was able to grab onto that and say, aha, they see it too. It isn't just me. But still, I do wonder if I'm the one with the problem. Is this a typical pattern? Or am I the one with the problem? How do I know? And as an interesting side note, I have never discussed this with my husband, but last year we were at a Marian shrine and Our Lady came to him and told him that she would be the one to affirm him in so many words. I was shocked because the self-awareness of needing to be appraised could only have come from a divine origin. He uses those words now and knows that he has a need to be praised that is not healthy. So, a lot there to unpack. I thought I would just give this all to you. I know you had a chance to review this before we talked. What seems significant for our audience to share about this as you hear the story from this listener?
So I did just briefly have a chance to review this, but to clarify. But yeah, no, a couple of things come out. The confusion that this person has on whether or not it's the husband or her, that's the narcissist. That's such a complicated thing. As I do some marital therapy work, and when I hear one spouse talk about what happened versus another spouse talking about what happened separately, I do feel sometimes I don't know which planet I'm on. So it gets so confusing. And part of the reason it is if he is narcissistic, there's a tendency for the narcissist to put the blame on her as if she is. Right. So, and if she is that narcissistic extension that isn't meeting his needs or his wants, maybe it's a better way to put it, for kind of the self-esteem fix, then she will now become devalued quickly in his eyes. And if she communicates the concern to him, then what will happen is he might accuse her of being selfish or whatever. So I can sense how confusing that is in that relationship for her. So I feel for her in that dynamic. So that was one thing that really stood out to me.
What I really stood out to me, so thank you for that. I agree, right? It can be very disorienting to be in a relationship with someone who needs to use you as for narcissistic supply, to meet those deep needs. We're going to be talking about that in episode 122. I'm anticipating that episode 122 will be about gaslighting. I'm going to discuss gaslighting from a Catholic perspective, what that is. But the thing that struck me the most out of this passage was near the end, where there was this awareness that this is about affirmation, and that the affirmation that's needed is the affirmation from God and Our Lady, especially from God our Father and Mary our Mother, our spiritual parents, our primary parents. There is no thing in the created world that will fill the need we have to be loved, to be cherished, to be treasured, to be delighted in by our Lord and Our Lady. And so that's what really struck me the most. And I don't know, I mean, I wasn't there, and I can't actually evaluate, was something of divine origin or something of angelic origin, but this fits so well, this idea that if indeed there's narcissistic dynamics going on here, the need for affirmation is where we need to be actually looking. But the difficulty is that the vulnerability required to take in the love of God can be so threatening to folks that struggle with narcissistic dynamics, who have a strong protection up against that vulnerability.
Yeah, I agree. That does stand out to me too. Like this craving, it can feel, for some narcissistic profiles or parts that have that, it can feel very much like this drug, this affirmation drug.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't get that quick hit or that fix from the other person, then the other person now becomes small and unimportant and an object of criticism.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the approval that they need, that would be healthy, is not so much the external approval, like you're saying. It's more that kind of divine kind of approval, that connection with God that can provide for them those needs that they have been longing for, but just haven't gotten in a consistent fashion. Kind of reminds me of this kind of need of the other person to provide. It reminds me of a couple quotes that the best relationships are those in which the love for the other is greater than the need for the other. And then a second one, this one's by Brennan Manning. He says, you are loved just as you are, not as you should be, because you're never going to be as you should be, especially, this side of the curtain. And so that underlying affirmation to be loved is actually a good thing, that desire to be loved, but to be loved as you are. Because in the narcissistic history, especially like you brought out in your podcast, that wasn't the case, generally speaking. It wasn't the case that you could just be as you are. You would be evaluated as you are, but not necessarily loved, and so forth.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that makes total sense to me. I think about it along very similar lines. And so what I'd like to do now is to just open this up to anyone that has questions, anyone that would like to ask those out loud, or that would like to submit a question to us via the chat function. I'm really curious. Let me put it this way. I'm really curious about what you're curious about with narcissism. So just super interested to hear about like what's on your minds, what questions come up, what kinds of things would you like to know more about? So Dr. Peter Martin and I, we're standing by, we're ready to hear from you. So let us know. Okay, we've got one coming in through the chat. So let's start with that. So this one says, I appreciate the previous listener's question, but it sounds like she and her husband share a Catholic faith. My greatest challenge when faced with narcissism is with those who are in my life, my relationships such as family, who do not recognize God, and thus it becomes very difficult to even share with them with love because they do not believe in a God who could love them for simply being themselves. What can we say to them? So my first reaction to this question, which I think is a great one, how do you work with somebody? How do you love somebody that doesn't acknowledge God and doesn't acknowledge God as love? And so what do you say to them is what our listener is asking. And I would say, first of all, I probably wouldn't say anything. I would think more about it in terms of being with the other person. Many people have parts that are really turned off on God. They have really negative God images. There's been ways that they've experienced authority, ways that they've experienced father figures, authority figures that have turned them off to the idea of God as Father. And so, as St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel, use words when necessary. And then I would be looking to what goods can they recognize and accept. This is really an attuned way of finding what kind of common ground you have to that person. What kinds of things can they accept that you can offer them? And sometimes that might not seem like very much. But if folks are willing to allow a little bit of love in, it can have a powerfully transformative effect. And at the beginning, that probably means in a case like this that you're not discussing God, you're not bringing up God, that you're demonstrating the love of God through your interactions, that you are, in a sense, being that conduit of God's love to the person. I'm curious what you would add to that, Dr. Peter.
Yeah, no, I like the trajectory you're going there, because you can imagine someone who is struggling with God or not interested in God and so forth, and their history of talking to people that are theistic, right? Talking to people that believe in God, they're probably used to the standard response of, this is why you should believe in God. And so if you add yourself to that long undistinguished list of people, probably what'll happen is they might just kind of turn a deaf ear to it to some extent. But if you turn to them more in a stance of curiosity, like you were saying, kind of a stance of getting to know them and understanding them, hearing their story, hearing what they have to say, well, a couple things can happen. One is you're going to get that connection, which is going to be pivotal for anything you talk about God with them. And secondly, you can do a bit of an assessment, right? You can to some extent hear in their languaging how open they actually are to hearing anything about that to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So my Irish grandmother had told me a story one time. She said there was a priest she had spoken to who said, he said, I will drive clear across town to talk with someone about God who is open to hearing what I have to say. He said, but I will not walk across this room to someone that will just shut me down. So
Mm-hmm.
the idea is you get a bit of a test, a little bit of a litmus to see how open that person might be. If they're not open, that's their season of life. Who knows if another opportunity might show up in the future, though. But for now, let's make a connection and get to know their side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what I would say is, yeah, definitely along those lines, what goods can they accept? And yeah, so many times we're going to have to go back to prayer. We're going to have to go back to making sacrifices for folks, allowing grace to work. Remember, not everybody is going to respond to love. If you think about the terror that folks with strong narcissistic dynamics have at a deep level of no longer existing, of being annihilated. I mean, it's frightening. It's terrifying for these folks to tolerate being loved as they are. They would have to give up their primary ways of coping in the world in order to let that love in. So I think if we're trying to show them that love, we need to recognize how high the stakes are. This isn't just people that are being selfish or self-absorbed. These are folks that are experiencing an existential crisis as to whether or not I'm going to leave the pseudo security of my coping mechanisms, the ways that I've learned to make it in the world, in favor of this brand new idea of vulnerability, this brand new idea that I could be loved as I am, this brand new idea of letting you into my life. And I think sometimes because they come across as often abrasive or large and in charge or grandiose, it can be so deceiving, it can be so misleading to take that at face value.
I have a question here that someone posted on the chat. It says, good evening from the UK. Question. What hello, UK. What are your views on ad orientem, theocentric worship, and versus populum, sorry about my Latin, anthropocentric worship? Could either affect or impact narcissistic traits in groups or individuals, such as clergy or laity? Let's see here. So I can say that again. What are your views on ad orientem, theocentric worship, and versus populum, which is anthropocentric worship, could either affect or impact narcissistic traits in groups or individuals, such as clergy or laity? Peter, I might float that.
Frankly, I don't think it matters much, to be really honest with you. I don't, because sometimes there's this sense that if we had the liturgical stuff right, that would have a beneficial effect and would resolve these sorts of issues. I think in certain circles, you can have a kind of spiritual narcissism. I hinted at this in the previous one, and it can be expressed through the need for a perfect worship, and so sometimes that can come up. Theocentric versus anthropocentric worship. Of course, obviously, we don't want anthropocentric worship where we're worshiping ourselves. I think some of the modern liturgical songs, I wouldn't call them hymns, they're songs, can be very focused on the self. There was a recent article in the New Oxford Review about that. But I'm concerned when we start to take the focus on narcissistic dynamics outside and start attributing it to cultural factors or social factors or community factors. I think the focus really needs to be on what's going on in the internal dynamics, because that's something that plays right into the narcissist game. The external environment has to change for me to be all right. And I think we really need to take ownership of our own dynamics. We need to take real responsibility for that, and to not say things like, well, if the liturgy were better, or if my parish were better, or other types of things like that, or if the architecture was better, that then I would be in a better place. Remember, all things work together for good for those who love the Lord. So if you happen to be in an area where the liturgical rubrics aren't being followed very closely, but that's the one mass you can go to, God's going to make good happen from that mass as well. So
Yeah, Dr. Peter, I would concur with everything you said there. I think a person who has narcissistic tendencies can make just about any venture narcissistic, right? So let's say a person is interested in developing virtue, and their focus is to try to increase their eating habits and nutrition intake and things like that. And a narcissistic person or a profile, that individual would be prone to turning that into a self-glamorous kind of approach. It would be about, oh, look how good my body's going to look and how amazing I'm going to be, and all the people that will worship me if I have this appearance or whatever. And they'll turn it into something that would actually be the opposite of virtue in that effort. So to Peter's point, I think that those efforts, sure, some of the context plays a role, but it does seem like you can make just about any effort, including virtue, into a narcissistic venture. I can I can flog myself in public or pour ashes on my forehead, those kinds of things to make it more dramatic and so forth. More about me than the actual growth.
I want to just create a space. Does anybody would like to come up and just ask a question out loud? Would that be, can we do that? All right, excellent. Claire, do ask.
Hi, Dr. Peter Malinowski and Dr. Peter Martin. Thank you for having this opportunity to bring to our awareness about narcissism. I do have a question, and I was interested to know what you both thought. Has the church or professional counseling, clinical mental health addressed the link between narcissism and spiritual abuse? And then how do religious members or subjects recover if a superior with narcissistic tendencies and behavior is removed from an organized religion or community? Or can those religious members or subjects recover if the superior who has a narcissistic behavior or tendency is not removed? If you want me to repeat my question, I could. I'm just interested to know what your thoughts were on that. Narcissism, spiritual abuse. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the International Cultic Studies Association, ICSA, is an organization that I've been involved with for 30 years. And I am one of, or maybe their top go-to person when it comes to reports of a monastery or a convent or some other Catholic group that's gone off the rails. And so I've had the privilege, I've had the experience of being invited into a number of religious communities where there's been serious allegations of abuse, spiritual abuse and harm. And almost always you will see very strong narcissistic dynamics in the leaders of those communities. So there is a direct connection between spiritual abuse and narcissistic dynamics in religious communities in the church. And that's really unfortunate. The response, in my experience, the response is very mixed. It depends on who is an authority, who are the local authorities, who are the ordinaries, who are the leaders of the religious communities, the abbots or the regional superiors, the district superiors, as far as how that gets handled. What I've noticed over and over again is that there is a lack of awareness of these human formation dynamics, a lack of awareness of what goes on in the psychological and spiritual realm. There's a lot of spiritualizing, a lot of spiritual bypassing that can happen. And frankly, I've been disappointed in a lot of what I've seen in the ways that church leaders have handled these kinds of situations. And I think one of the things that's going to come out more and more in the next few years is how can we more successfully, more effectively as a church care for those that have been harmed in religious communities or in religious organizations. There's a book that I recommend called Narcissism Goes to Church by Chuck DeGroat, which I think has, now he's not Catholic, but that has a lot of good information about how you understand those dynamics.
Thank you, Dr. Peter Malinowski.
what would you add? What would you add, dear Peter Martin?
I really don't have much that I think you covered most of the basic things I would have said. But yeah, but it is problematic, and I mean, you'll see it at different levels with clericalism, as a term that comes out a fair amount with priests that struggle with this and how that might cause problems. But what you'll see is, at least in that particular area, you'll see an emphasis in some ways just on kind of elevating the self, but then the pastoral sense, like that pastoral care for the sheep, is not really taking place. And so then what happens is it kind of in some ways can fragment the flock, or you can have these kind of groups of people in the church that just really admire this particular priest. But either way, it's problematic because it doesn't seem open to uniting and bringing the flock together. But no, I would support everything else that Peter said as well.
There's a lot of confusion that can happen because there can be a lot of idealization of narcissistic leaders. They pull for that idealization, and it can seem like that's the right thing to do because, if I'm in a religious community, I owe obedience, I have a vow of obedience and so forth. And so if there's poor human formation among the formators, among those in authority, can wreak a lot of harm on the members of a community. And I've seen, entire communities fragment, blow up, and the consequences can be really, really severe. So at some point, I want to do a whole series on spiritual abuse. It's not going to be in the near future, but that is a question that has been so misunderstood because those on the spiritual side of things don't necessarily understand the psychological aspects of it, and those on the psychological side of things don't often understand the spiritual dimensions of it. So it's something where there can be a lot of room for greater understanding that can lead to more compassionate and more ordered care for folks that have been harmed.
Thank you, Dr. Peter Malinowski and Dr. Peter Martin. It's a topic that hasn't had much attention to and research, so I greatly appreciate your thorough information. Helps a lot.
Well, let's take a look at some of these others. What makes it difficult for a person with narcissistic personality disorder to receive the love of God? What makes it difficult for a person with narcissistic personality disorder to receive the love of God?
Yeah, I can take that here first. So one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at the research on attachment to God, for instance, one of the things you'll find is that there's a particular attachment that seems to be the least connected to God, and that's called dismissing attachment. And so dismissing attachment is connected or associated with overt narcissism, kind of grandiose overt narcissism in the research. And what you'll see is that those individuals at a natural level generally keep people at arm's distance, so they don't feel comfortable getting too close to others in a let's say an intimate relationship or an attachment-based relationship. And that natural level kind of experience that was developed over the course of, let's say, their childhood with a parent or later on, now that kind of is the way they relate to God, is that they see him as kind of distant or just he doesn't exist. G.K. Chesterton says atheism is less a denial of God than it is a defiance of God. And so if you take that kind of defiance and distancing and maybe mistrust, because you'll see guys like Christopher Hitchens, for instance, that will say God is some type of internal North Korean dictator that invades my every thought, my every feeling, my every experience. And so they see God as kind of this boss that's too close and tries to impose himself too much. And that's the experience. And so I remember when I read that about the way Hitchens described him, I said, wow, that doesn't feel anything like my experience of God. He doesn't feel like he's invasive. He feels like someone that loves me and that I want to be close to and intimate with and connected to. So I think that is a big obstacle to someone that has maybe kind of dismissing attachment attributes or narcissistic kind of grandiose profile. If you look at the flip side of that in the attachment research, the preoccupied attachment actually is associated with covert narcissism. So this would be someone that has kind of high expectations and demands of others, but may not voice them very much. But if you look at their internal kind of monologue, you'll see that it does have narcissistic features. And what'll happen is that individual typically doesn't feel very connected and soothed by God. They can petition God, they can ask God for help in prayer, but then allowing God to be close without the fear that God will not be there for them in a time of need makes it complicated for them to feel secure and trusting toward God. So I think those two types of narcissistic profiles can find it difficult to having intimacy with God, as well as other people. But in this case, God is the person was questioning.
Well, there's another question here, since you've brought up the attachment questions, and you know more about attachment theory than I do. I want to hear how you handle this one. How does narcissism impact attachment in children and then later in adulthood? So if you could just expand out on your answer to that previous question to include how does narcissism impact attachment in children and later in adulthood?
It's a great question, and I'll throw in some parts language here, just some things as I was reading a bit for this particular podcast. What happens in the relationship, let's say this developing mind, this individual child who's connecting with their parent, who is, let's say, narcissistic, and is using that child, not loving, but using that child as a narcissistic extension. What happens is the child doesn't really attach to the self of the parent. And that's kind of important because some IFS theorists, for instance, will say that an attachment that's insecure is because they're attaching not to the self of the parent, but to a part of the parent. And so in this case, with a narcissistic parent, the child is probably attaching to a protector part that's overcompensating for a sense of, low self-esteem or a shame or something like that. And then what happens in that kind of dyadic relationship then is that the parent is not really pulling for the self of the child in that relationship. It's actually pulling for some kind of protector part from the child. So to give an example, if the parent is narcissistic, and let's say those wounds kind of show in the way it manifests in kind of expecting too much or hypercritical of the child or something, then what happens is they don't just want a response that's assertive. They want that child to rescue them out of their own insecurity. And so if that child learns that the way that they can attach or at least get some kind of connection with the parent is to respond in a way that overcompensates, that does too much, and then they get the smile from the parent or whatever, then that nurtures this kind of reactivity, and it nurtures the reinforcement or development of a protector part in that particular child. And then the cycle continues, right? And so what happens is this narcissism can continue in the next generation and then maybe even beyond. But ultimately, it turns into an insecurity and a struggle with intimacy. One of the things you had mentioned, Nancy McWilliams, Dr. Malinowski, in your podcast that was just released today, you had mentioned Nancy McWilliams. And one of the things that she says is that people with, I think it's neurotic level, no, I think it's borderline level of personality organization or severity of personality, borderline and psychotic level, they don't have the capacity for intimacy. They don't have that integrity or that unity of self, that personal unity to be able to find that union that's real, to be able to have that union with others, or in this case, a parent with a child. And so this cycle of dysfunction continues into the next generation.
One of the things that she brings up in the chapter on narcissism is that individuals who have been raised by parents with prominent narcissistic tendencies and have been treated as narcissistic extensions of the parent, who are kind of like in orbit around the parent's needs, often develop narcissistic tendencies themselves. And
and that fits too, because going back to that research and attachment, so the idea is that there is a level of entitlement that you see with all types to some extent of attachment insecurity. You'll see that surfacing. Some of the researchers in this are like Philip Shaver, Michellenser are the two people that are kind of prominent. But they have found that both attachment anxiety and avoidance are associated with two kind of key things. One, a global sense of psychological entitlement, as well as two, a strong entitlement urges in close relationships. So global and then specific in attachment relationships. That's kind of important because at some level, what you have with insecurity is like a limited sense of peace. There's a kind of heightened level of distress. And so if these individuals are more commonly or more apt to kind of leave their window of tolerance, then what happens is they're going to be going into survival mode more frequently. So fight, flight, freeze. And the language that you'll see in some of this autonomic nervous system, kind of research and literature, you'll see them talking about if you're in survival mode, fight, flight, freeze, it's self-survival. Whereas if you're in the window of tolerance, which is the optimal kind of more peaceful range, they call that species survival.
Ooh.
So the species survival, I don't like that language, but we'll use it. Species survival then allows this person a greater capacity to love the other, whereas the other approach, the survival, is based more on fear. So those are fear-based relationships rather than kind of the love-based relationships. And you'll see that more with insecure attachment.
So let's see.
I've got one here.
Oh, great. Yeah.
So does codependency often accompany a relationship between a narcissistic parent and his or her child? Does codependency often accompany a relationship between a narcissistic parent and his or her child? One of the things that stands out to me about a narcissistic parent is that the boundaries aren't the greatest with children. And so if a mother, let's just take the case of a mother, well, we'll say father this time, the case of a father, and let's say his relationship with his son gets enmeshed, and you might say that's an aspect of codependency. But let's say it gets enmeshed. Now that's not really the child's fault, right? The child is just attaching and kind of learning from the parent, learning how to live morally and ethically, but also just how to be a male in this particular case. And so who does that fall on? Well, it falls on the parent, the father in this case, for not setting good boundaries and allowing the other person to not be a narcissistic extension, but allowing the other person to have viewpoints that differ, allowing the other person to kind of have feelings that are acceptable, that they can feel even if they might be different than the parent. One of the things you'll find sometimes in a narcissistic profile is vocational discernment gets kind of interesting for a child because what happens is it's really interesting. The child might be in a state of confusion about which direction or what state of life the person is called to do. But for some reason, the parent knows exactly what the child is called to, and oftentimes can tell them repeatedly what that person should be discerning and going towards. So yeah, it becomes complicated. But yeah, I do think codependency and kind of this enmeshment, for instance, can be a part of a narcissistic relationship.
A lot of it depends, I think, on what you mean by codependency. The mom or the dad that's demonstrating a lot of narcissism needs the child functionally, needs the function of that the child can offer, because children are so existentially dependent on their parents, and they know it. Without their parents' attention, they won't survive. So the bind that a child of a narcissistic parent is in is that I've got choices here, and I'm going to, in most cases, attempt to conform myself to what my parents demanding of me, or I won't make it. And that leads to problems at 3 particular ages. And these are the moments of separation and individuation: 2, 7, 6 or 7, and then the early teenage years. Because these are the moments when a child needs help from the parent to establish a separate identity. But that separate identity is going to mean that there's going to be some friction in the relationship. The terrible twos, the 6 and 7-year-old who is now, discovering that I can go to school, or I have, I can actually function autonomously in the world. The teenager that's preparing for adulthood. these can be times where intentionally or often unintentionally, children can wound their parents, and those wounds are felt particularly deeply if if it looks like the narcissistic supplies will no longer be regularly offered. And so there's often a lot of estrangement that can happen between children when they want to shuck off that dependency, or an alternative response is to just never really grow up and separate and individuate, but to continue to serve the needs of the parent in a disordered way. So, and that's really confusing for children. It's one of the huge disadvantages of having a parent who struggles with a lot of narcissism.
Yeah. One kind of follow-up there, I appreciate what you brought in there about those different ages and the challenges for parents and children in those stages. One of the things, going back to the codependency, you'll see a fair amount of kind of this role reversal or inversion of the attachment relationship. In those kind of relationships, you'll see this kind of dynamic where the parent, going back to the boundaries struggle, the parent is more likely to disclose just way too much information about their emotional struggles. They get way too open about let's say the marital conflicts with their children. Let's say if the child's like age 7, for instance, they'll talk about that. And even it can get kind of strange in the sense that it could even be physical affection starts to go a little too far. And so, yeah, so you run into this kind of challenge where, again, this becomes you, child, become my need provider. Whereas if a parent as the attachment figure, it is not a relationship of equals. And it's not a relationship of codependency in a secure relationship. It's where the parent provides for the physical and emotional needs of the child, and not vice versa.
Right. That's that parentification of children. Now your role is to meet my needs, says, in the narcissistic parent. So yeah, and that could really do a number on kids. It can take a lot to get over that. And so, and we have a question about that just kind of came in that I thought we could move in now. What tools and skills can a child be supported to develop if they have a parent with narcissistic tendencies? Or does the child need to wait until they are an adult and seek psychotherapy? So what would you say to that? So a lot of times you can see this in other families, could be, extended family of your own, or you could see it, in church, down in the coffee and donuts after mass, you can see it on the playground. What kinds of things can we be thinking about that would help children who are in a situation like this to develop more normally? Let's say if you're an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or something like that.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so the idea is that these children have particular needs that are not being met because the parent has such a focus on themselves that they're not quite sure how to meet these needs of the child in a consistent, reliable fashion, or at all in some cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you might have a case of a child that just never felt safe. They never felt safe their whole life consistently. They never felt seen and known, which is probably pretty common for a child that's being raised by a narcissistic parent. So one thing I would say is it would be helpful if that child could find some type of a mentor or like an adult figure that they could rely on. You'll see some people that will turn to a grandparent, or they might turn to an aunt or an uncle or someone else that they can turn to talk about these struggles and these confusing things that they're getting. So that would be one kind of strong recommendation, is to kind of turn to them as I don't know, I wouldn't say a substitute kind of attachment figure, but someone they can turn to for some of those attachment needs would be an important thing.
One of the things though to remember is that if you as an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or a friend or an extended relative or something like that, if the narcissistic parent begins to believe that you're turning the child against them, you can expect a pretty strong reaction. Because again, if that parent, the narcissistic parent, is looking at the child as a source of life, as a source of life-giving affirmation that contributes to their existence, and you are a threat to take that away, boy, you can expect that there's going to be some reaction to that. So one of the things I would add to what you just said, Dr. Martin, would be just to bear that in mind, to kind of bear those broader family dynamics in mind, and remember that God in his permissive will allows these things to happen to children only to be able to draw greater good from them in the future. And so there are some folks who with negative parenting actually seek out a deeper relationship with God as Father and Mary as Mother. Some of the God image literature, the attachment to God literature, shows that there can be lower levels of motivation to seek out God as a good father, or Mary as a good mother. God is a good father. I don't think they looked at Mary as a good mother. If your parents have been relatively good, so there's sort of something paradoxical there about that. So,
that's a good kind of distinction there, Dr. Malinowski. The idea that a mentor can actually amplify the reactions in the parents if they don't pay attention to those protector parts of the parent. So if they're kind of saying, hey, try this, try that, niece, nephew, and it just actually increases the anger in the protector parts of the narcissistic person, that's going to be problematic, definitely. So always keep that in mind.
Definitely. And we are going to have Dr. Jerry Crete in mid-October to do a whole episode on how do you work on these family dynamics with narcissism. Many of you know him. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's the co-founder of Souls and Hearts. So episode 123 in October, we will be having him on to answer all kinds of questions about family dynamics with that. But I wanted to recognize we have Michael that's got a question for us. So I'm going to open the floor. If you would ask your question, Michael.
Yes, thank you very much. I just had a question. You described my ex-wife perfectly. So as a divorced dad that's recognizing this within his children and trying to co-parent and be the good parent, what advice would you both offer? Would your advice still be the same or something different?
It really depends on the situation. And it takes a lot of discernment to know how to navigate those tricky waters. So the first thing that I would recommend is that you have some professional eyes, some professional help to help you navigate this on your end of it. I mean, that would be my recommendation for anybody in that situation. Someone that, comes to know you, that can advocate for, your best interest, and that can help you to address those kinds of questions, because the way that plays out can take on a lot of different variations depending on the circumstances, the given situations. There's not a one size fits all type of approach. There's not a protocol that you can execute against. Oftentimes it's very difficult for divorced spouses to be able to offer anything that is not burdened by the history of the relationship, because there's a whole lot of disappointed hopes and dreams that can go into marriages that have failed. And so often we need to rely on others to be able to reach the spouse, unless you are, you have a particularly good relationship. So if the divorce was especially messy, contentious, the more that's true, the more that external support's going to be needed. It's also really important as a divorced parent, I would say, to not try to undermine or split or triangulate children against the other parent. Because if they sense that you're trying to do that, then again, it's likely that because of the need for affirmation, that there could be this intense polarization that happens. So, but I know that your Dr. Peter Martin, you work with families more than I do. So I'm just curious if you have something that you would add to that, or that you would correct in that, actually. So,
no, I don't think I would correct anything. When you were talking about this is a similar thing that you've noticed in your relationship, and I don't know the specs and the details of which side of the attachment spectrum she might be on and that kind of thing. One thing, there's two things that came to mind though, and both of these are kind of one has to do with a template for looking at what's going on And the second one has to do with kind of your own personal kind of growth, because this is a very complicated situation, like you said, and it just requires so much, virtue and to be able to manage it. But the first thing that comes to mind, when there's a trauma in a relationship, and I don't know what happened, I'm just going to float this out there for people. When there's a trauma in a marriage, or trauma is brought to marriage, for instance, the Gottmans have noted, John Gottman and his wife, Julie, I think's her name, they actually have developed a different model for treating marital dysfunction if there's trauma in the marriage, whether it's through something the husband or the wife has done, whether it's infidelity, whether it's like, something with a major medical issue that they had to work through, or whatever, right? And so if I remember correctly, when we did this training, they had said that it's not uncommon when there's trauma in there that one of the spouses feels borderline and the other spouse feels narcissistic. And part of it has to do because of that deep kind of abiding wound that gets triggered pretty quickly. And so people respond in kind of curious ways, like, spouses respond in real curious ways when they have that kind of history. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing, I would encourage you, to Dr. Malinowski's point about getting like a professional or third party involved. The level, like one of the best things that you can do as a father in terms of helping your children through this complicated situation that seems to be continuing, if you said your spouse is struggling with things too, is to really become a man of prayer, a person that has a deep spiritual life, because you're going to need to draw upon the sources of, let's say, God as an example that could provide this example to you of how to respond. And one of the things that you'll find is that curiosity and calm are two critical 8 C's of dealing with your spouse in this situation. Like if you were to focus on how to interact with her, it would be, how can I maintain the calm of a Saint Joseph and the curiosity of, I don't have anybody else to give it, let's say Saint Joseph, curiosity of Saint Joseph here, to be able to display to not only to your wife, but also the children, how to kind of maintain that in your relationship with her. But sometimes there will need to be frank conversations about if you're seeing like egregious boundary violations and things like that, that will probably require a third party professional to help with that.
And I would just add to anybody in that situation to really pay attention to your own attachment needs and your own integrity needs, to really have those grounded so that you can love a woman who might be the most difficult person in the world for you to love. Even if your marriage was if you have a decree of nullity and so there never was a marriage, there's still going to be a lot in raising minor children. If you don't have a decree of nullity, in the eyes of the church, you're still married to her, to try to be able to love her anyway, but in a way that does not harm your integrity. That's really, really important. What is best for you is also what's best for her. What's best for her is also what's best for you. There's a harmony or a symphony around what's best. And so we want to be able to see if we can find that so that we can come to a course of action that's best for her, best for you, best for your children. Is that helpful? Is there a follow-up to that, Michael, at all? Or okay, great. Well, that leads us to this question again that I think is really helpful, or that dovetails right with this, and that is, could you comment on when and how to assert boundaries for one's own well-being while being charitable and witnessing to God? And this, again, we're going to get into in spades in episode 123 in October. But this question keeps coming up. How do I not lose myself in a relationship with a narcissist or somebody who's narcissistic? How do I not lose myself? How do I not just give in? But how do I still relate in a loving way? How can I be Christian? How can I be Catholic in the fullest sense of the word when dealing with somebody who in my life is narcissistic?
That is a complicated question. So I'm glad you're going to be devoting so much time to it in the future. Yeah, so I think when it comes to boundaries with someone that has narcissistic tendencies, just assume they don't know how to implement them, or if they do, they don't know how to implement them regularly. So in some sense, that means the burden in some ways is on you to be able to implement those boundaries in a consistent fashion. It's
Mhm.
not an easy kind of response to the question, but it is something that's important. And I do recommend, any type of change of boundaries, you're going to need some kind of external support for that, like a mentor to help you with that, or a friend, a loved one, because you're gonna find yourself feeling confused in the kind of reactions you might get from
Mhm.
them, because the reactions you'll get will be disproportionately large and extreme, probably compared to what you were asking for the boundary. So that would be kind of one thing. The other thing is, if the narcissistic tendency is toward approval seeking and entitlement, we don't want you to shift to the other extreme and become subjugating and self-sacrificing, right? That's not the answer. The answer is not to be the polar opposite, because what that does is that actually feeds into the narcissism. Now, it may stop them from getting so angry and reactive, at least for a time period, but that's not the answer. You're still going to want to be assertive. So one way to think of it is, on one extreme, you have kind of aggressive and passive aggressive approaches to communicating boundaries. And with what's interesting about both of those is that only one person matters in the dyad, in the two-person relationship, and it's not you. So if the other person's aggressive or passive aggressive, you're not really at the forefront of their thinking about how this should be done. On the flip side, if you become passive, and let's say that's more the subjugating, self-sacrificing, if you become passive, really only one person matters in that relationship too. And it's not you, it's the other person. So if you're passive, the other person matters more than you do. If you're aggressive, or let's say they're aggressive or passive aggressive, you again don't matter. Their opinion matters. So the only response that really seems to fit in terms of, kind of what Dr. Malinowski was saying about integrity needs and about respecting your own dignity and things like that, is that you're in a relationship of equals, and reminding yourself you're a relationship of equals. Just because they say things louder and more harshly doesn't mean they're more right. You're in this relationship of equals. So the assertive person hears and understands the other person's side, at the same time hears and understands your voice and what your concerns are. If you struggle with that, because let's say you're in a relationship where the narcissist has been the dominant figure, you're not used to probably noticing the desires of your heart. You're not used to paying attention to those promptings inside, because you've been trained, so to speak, or there has been a consistent kind of tendency in your spouse to kind of tell you your desires aren't as important and they're not equal. So what I'll tell people sometimes is, as you're discerning how to set these boundaries, first begin with thinking about what are the desires of your heart. And as St. Augustine would say, love and do as you will. So do in all things charity, but noticing what are the desires of your heart, paying attention to those, as if the other person doesn't quite have an opinion just yet, right? But noticing it, and then taking those views and those desires, those opinions, comparing them to the other person's desires, views, and opinions, and then trying to find some kind of healthy middle ground that's not harmful, and it's not implemented in a vengeful way or anything, but just literally out of love. Because by you doing that, it actually is within the realm of love to do it that way.
Really like that, Peter. Thank you. And the one thing I would add is to be aware as you're introspecting, as you're paying some attention to your own reactions and to your own current state. And this is advice not just for situations and working with folks with narcissistic dynamics, but to consider what is the most loving or the best response available in my repertoire right now. And sometimes that may mean to withdraw from the situation. Maybe the best thing in certain situations in humility is to withdraw. Primerum non nocere, first do no harm. There are times where if one of my children get under my skin, where the best thing I can do is to withdraw so that I don't do something that's harmful, so that I don't act out. So we need to be able to think about not what would I like to do, or not what would the saints do in this situation, because you may not be at that level of sanctity, and that may be a little grandiose to think that you could just act as as Mother Teresa would, or some other saint that you admire and that you're trying to emulate, but to be really realistic about what kinds of things can I handle right now, and to respond accordingly. And that's going to be very dynamic. That's going to shift a lot depending on, how much integration you have in the moment. I would say where your parts are in that moment, how much recollection you have, and so forth. So that gets easier as you practice it,
I like that, especially that Latin. That's impressive. I don't even know what that. Yeah, no, I agree. Like, to take a developmental standpoint on boundary setting is really important. If you weren't, to Dr. Malinowski's point, where you're at now might be, I just can't go forward with this, and I just need some space. Like, that might be where you're at. And even if Mother Teresa of Calcutta could have done it differently, that she may have, but right now, this is where God has placed you to grow in virtue. The thing about God, he's not going to. Sometimes he'll just give you infused courage, let's say, but a lot of times he'll just give you opportunities to practice courage, practice those. And it might be the most courageous thing you can do is just to leave that situation right then and there. But that developmental standpoint is going to be important, because I think G.K. Chesterton says, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing badly, right? Because that's your first step. That's your first step in the developmental process of developing this key strength eventually.
And Dr. Peter Martin, you and I have a psychologist friend, Dr. John Cadwallader, who is a psychologist in Indianapolis. And he's noted for playing the long game. He will play the long game. And I love that language. And I love to think about him playing the long game, because we're in these relationships, especially if they are with a spouse or with a parent or with a child. We want to be thinking about the long game, that it's not just about what happens right now, but where does this set us up for some future interaction? So to be kind of considering that. And sometimes what's best for the long game is actually an estrangement for a period of time, and actually withdrawing from a relationship so that there can be enough healing, so you can get enough stability, so that you can get enough groundedness, enough recollection, enough healing to happen to be able to love the person, to love that person in the future. So sometimes that's just not possible if you are continually being re-injured, or you're finding that you're just so caught up in the dynamics of that relationship that it's hard to get your feet under you. Sometimes this happens with children of narcissistic parents, where they need 6 months, a year, to be able to cut off contact so that they can get enough formation so that they have a base from which to love the parent in a more ordered way. So those are real radical decisions. I hope that those decisions aren't taken lightly, or that they are, and that there's like good counsel that goes with them from somebody that understands the relational dynamics. So
here's a question came up. When the narcissistic person sets rules for multiple little things or behaviors, what is the best response? So I'm getting the sense in that question that it's like too constricting and it's excessive, kind of rules and little things like that. What's the best response? I guess I'm not sure what kind of relationship it is. Like, is it a parent-child, or is it a spousal relationship, or is it like in a religious life or in a diocese or something? But yeah, any thoughts on that, Dr. Malinowski?
Again, I would look at what's the function. If we can begin to read what's the motivation, what's the good the person is seeking.
She responded, sorry to interrupt. She responded, it's a relationship of equals with another religious system.
Okay. Yeah. So I would look at what is the good that the other person is seeking by attempting to impose these rules or these conditions. And so I often think about, okay, what is the fear? What would happen if those things didn't happen? If they didn't go the way that the other person is hoping that they would go in terms of their, their implementation? Is there something that they're trying to avoid? Is it, for example, that those things are irritants and the person is trying to avoid blowing up in the community, and this is a way that they see that the belief is that if they have all of these things ordered on the outside, then there wouldn't be the reactivity on the inside. Well, then I might think about, how can I help that person feel safer in relationship, so that there's less to be focused on in terms of the outside order, the outside rules. What's the control? What's the motivation beyond the control? When you find people that are trying to control a lot, I tend to think about that as really fear-based. And so then what's the fear? What will happen? Remember, folks that are narcissistic, they are trying to avoid a collapse, a decompensation, where the wheels fall off the cart and they lose a sense of inner coherence and go into chaos. So a lot of times when you see this rigidity coming in, it's preferred to the chaos. Those are the two hallmarks of psychopathology, according to the founder of interpersonal neurobiology, Dan Siegel. You'll see this sort of, rigidity and chaos. So the rigidity is often a way of trying to prevent the chaos from taking over. So those are the types of things I would be thinking about. But if you find that it's really hard to think about those things, then I would go back to meeting your own needs. A lot of times people are trying to know how to deal with these situations in order to make it stop. And if you're dealing with this kind of behavior in a way to make it stop, then you're really not focused on the other person's highest good. You're focused on sort of self-protection. And I would go back to, okay, how can you feel more safe? How can you be more grounded so that this sort of thing doesn't create as much reactivity? Because if you go into that situation reactive, the other person's likely to be reactive as well. And there's going to be the potential for a lot of conflict and polarizations.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. Those are well stated. The one thing I might add to that is, if they're setting all this little rules and boundaries, then the implication is that people are crossing those rules and boundaries that really probably don't need there. And so not all cries of injustice are accurate. And so a person who has a lot of, let's say, strong narcissism may see, at every turn, at every path, they'll see unfairness. And they may authentically feel like they're being treated unfairly, but it's not objectively so. So it's not that you have to really change necessarily your ways or ask for forgiveness, come to them on your knees to ask forgiveness, but just kind of, and if you need a second set of eyes on that, this is, again, the confusion of this, getting a second set of eyes is going to be important. If you're wondering, did I do something wrong here? Because it doesn't feel like that, but this person keeps on setting these different rules and so forth.
So I have a question here. Have you done IFS work with narcissistic parts in clients? So have you done IFS work with narcissistic parts in clients, or ideal parent figure work using God as the parent and attachment figure? What kind of treatment has been found most effective in your work with narcissism? If there's an intense fear of being loved, what is the best way to love those with that fear? And so this is a great question to lead us into the next episode, because some of you might be wondering, why hasn't he talked much about parts? Why hasn't he talked much about systems thinking? Where's the IFS stuff? And that's what I'm going to be getting into in episode 120. That one's going to come out on Labor Day, the first Monday in September. So I'm going to be talking about how we can think about narcissism in a far more nuanced way in terms of parts, because as a little lead into that, I don't think that people are generally uniformly narcissist. I don't believe in this single unitary, homogeneous, monolithic personality. What I think happens with folks that are demonstrating narcissistic personality disorder, the symptoms of that or the criteria for that, is that they have managers with strong narcissistic dynamics that are dominating their systems, that they're blended with almost all the time. But those parts aren't the whole story of those individuals. And so We're going to be getting into that in episode 120. That's really what episode 120 is going to be about. How do we understand narcissism from a parts perspective? How do we understand it from a systems perspective? Because that is where I find so much hope in working with people, because so much of the time we believe that what you see is what you get. What's in the store window of folks with narcissism is all there is. But the fact is, there's a whole warehouse in the back of other parts, other dynamics that are not being given voice, because there isn't the sense yet of safety and security, because there isn't the sense of feeling like their integrity will be sustained, that their existence will go on if they really are seen, heard, known, and understood. Such a conflict around that second primary condition of secure attachment from Brown and Elliott with folks that are narcissists. On the one hand, they desperately need to be seen, heard, known, and understood, but they're terrified that if you really did see them, if you really did know them, if you really did understand them, you would reject them as parts of them have already rejected themselves. And so that's the really difficult thing, is to manage that fear. So that's what I think about when I'm working with folks, is how can I create enough conditions of safety so that there can be a little bit more opening to tolerating being loved? Because this whole endeavor of being loved is absolutely terrifying, because with that comes the vulnerability. And with that comes the potential to be shamed, to be humiliated, to be destroyed inside. It really does feel like that. It feels like an existential threat. So as you think about what does it mean to love these folks, definitely think about the boundaries. Definitely think about making sure that your own needs are met, that you're in a good place, that you're stable. But then think about the safety and security needs, and the fear, the terror of being humiliated. And unfortunately, what happens is that folks that are allowing these parts that are really narcissistic in their coping strategies to drive the buses, they get exactly what they don't want. They're more likely to set themselves up to be shamed or to be humiliated. And so that's the tragedy of this, is that it tends to become self-reinforcing and self-perpetuating.
Yeah, I agree. I think the way to work with them in some ways is to know that what you're getting is not really what's kind of driving the system underneath. You're going to encounter this kind of overcompensation, the narcissistic kind of managers and perfectionistic managers. That's what you're going to receive on a regular basis. But underneath it is this kind of shame and this woundedness. And so, as the saying goes, hurt people hurt people. And so you're used to seeing how that hurt kind of drives the system. The hurt shame drives the system into overcompensation and perfectionism and criticism. But underneath it, like Dr. Malowski was saying, underneath that, there's a fragile person. Now, the challenge is, depending on what kind of narcissist you have, if you have the grandiose, overt narcissist, the one that's very clear cut, you may have a tough time helping them to find that shame. Right? They may try to deny it and act like it's not there, and so forth. Whereas the other side of the spectrum, the covert narcissist, maybe you'll see more of that kind of insecurity. But yeah, so it's complicated. And thank heavens we have 6 podcasts to kind of address it.
Well, it has been a pleasure to be with you. It has been really enjoyable, Dr. Peter Martin, to spend some time with you, to be discussing these things, to be engaging with them, because I think they're so critical for so many folks. Look out for episode number 120. That'll be the next one. That will come out on Labor Day, as I said, the first Monday in September. We'll be addressing narcissism from an IFS perspective. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my perspectives on that with you, to give you a much deeper and broader understanding of it from a parts perspective, from systems thinking, and understanding some of the dynamics that go on from a parts perspective within a person that's struggling with narcissistic dynamics. And then after that, in mid-September, we will have an episode where I offer you an experiential exercise. That'll be in episode 121, when we have an experiential exercise to be able to go and get in touch with your parts that might have narcissistic tendencies themselves, or that have been in relationship with somebody that has narcissistic tendencies. We'll do an extended experiential exercise around that with some opportunities to debrief together and some opportunities for some questions and so forth. That episode will be recorded on Thursday, September 14th, 2023, from 7:30 p.m. to 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. And you can register for that Zoom meeting by going to our Interior Integration for Catholics landing page, which is at soulsandhearts.com/IIC. soulsandhearts.com/IIC, and get yourself that link. It's free. You can register, and it would be great to have you join us. Also, I wanted to let you know that we are in the middle of a series of weekly reflections. These come out by email every Wednesday on daydreaming. I'm going to invite you to check those out. Daydreaming, imagination, fantasy, internal acts. And we're going to be looking at how fantasies can help inform us about what's going on inside. There's a whole multi-part series. If you're not registered with Souls and Hearts, you won't get this. I encourage you, go to soulsandhearts.com, click on our homepage on the blue button that says Get Dr. Peter's Weekly Reflections in your email inbox every Wednesday, so that you can track along with that, because there's going to be some overlap with what we're talking about in this podcast series on narcissism. Finally, just an update. We have had an overwhelming response to the Resilient Catholics community. We are completing our onboarding process for the new cohort. That cohort is now closed, but we encourage people, if you're interested in the Resilient Catholics community, to sign up for our interest list. You can do that at soulsandhearts.com/RCC. And there's lots of information on that landing page about the community that's grown up around this podcast that is all about your human formation, learning to grow in love, learning to grow in relatedness, learning to consolidate and integrate identity. So I encourage you to check that out as well. So, dear Dr. Peter Martin, are you willing for people to reach out to you by email? Would you be open to that?
I am more than open, Dr. Malinowski. Yeah, please. I'm happy to give you the email address now, in fact.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's have that for our listeners. Where can they reach you if they'd like to follow up with you?
Definitely. docmartinrc@gmail.com. So docmartinrc@gmail.com.
So just a reminder, none of the things that we offer through Souls and Hearts are professional services. They are not clinical assessments. They're not psychotherapy. None of what happened in this podcast episode constitutes that kind of professional clinical advice. What we're doing is more educational. So we're not able to offer you those services, but we can certainly discuss the themes that have come up, the concepts that have come up in this episode tonight, episode 119, and to be able to continue the discussion. So if you'd like to take advantage of that, you're welcome to get in touch with Dr. Martin. My phone number, 317-567-9594. My email address, crisis@soulsandhearts.com. You're welcome to reach out to me, especially during my conversation hours, which are every Tuesday and Thursday from 4:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. With that, I'm going to invite folks to unmute as we invoke our patroness and our patron. We'll invoke our patroness and our patron together. And if you'd be willing to unmute and add your voice to the rest of the voices to be able to say those responses, that would be great. So, Our Lady, our Mother, untire of knots,
Pray for us.
Saint John the Baptist,
Pray for us.